I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and it's time to do another exploration of superwash versus non-superwash yarn to sort of show how the fiber content of the yarn base that you are picking for your project can influence the type of dyeing results that you get in the end. Typically, superwash yarn, and in particular superwash wool yarn, will absorb dye much faster than a non-superwash version of the same fiber content. And I think this has to do with the superwash process. It's easier for the dye molecules to sort of slip into the fibers. And so this means that you can usually get sharper color patches on the yarn when it's superwash. Whereas when it's non-superwash, you might get an overall softer effect with the same technique. The colors might be a little more spread, a little bit more blown out. And depending on what you're going for, that can be just as beautiful. I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to today's lab partner, Lori. Lori, thank you so much for being a lab partner for today's episode of Dyepot Weekly. I really hope you're gonna love your superwash yarn. I have done explorations and side-by-side comparisons like this a few times, including dyeing with Mio way back at the very beginning of Dyepot Weekly. And then I've also explored with a few other techniques and a few other superwash versus non-superwash types of bases. And in addition to these direct comparisons, I've had non-superwash yarn in the same pan with superwash yarn many times, but not always the same fiber content. One might be superwash merino nylon, one might be Peruvian highland wool, so it's not as direct of a comparison. So today, we're gonna do some countertop speckles with and without citric acid on a superwash and non-superwash version of the same yarn base. Here I have the Knit Picks Wool of the Andes line. Both are 100% Peruvian highland wool, but one of them is superwash and the other isn't. Texturally, the superwash yarn is a hair smoother, maybe likely because some of those scales have been removed during the superwash process, so that way it won't felt. And I personally don't find wool of the Andes rough. It's a wonderful workhorse yarn. Some people find it less soft than merino, but I can feel not a roughness, but it's a soft but more textured, I guess is the word that I would use. If you would like to learn more about the yarn bases or other tools and equipment I'm using in this video, I will have links and affiliate links down in the video description, and I may earn a commission if you make a purchase through one of my affiliate links. Okay, now this is the superwash skein. I'm labeling it on a zip tied with an SW on it so that way I can tell the difference. I think we'll be able to tell once we see how the dye is sort of striking our yarn, but it's always worth labeling just in case. I want to pre-soak our yarn in some plain tap water for around 30 minutes or so. I think with the technique I'm planning to do today, which I'm going to be filming the intro after this, so I will decide on that in a little bit. I think with the countertop technique I plan to do today, it will be okay if we have some dry patches in the yarn because we'll have some of the white left behind. And so then it shouldn't be particularly noticeable, but I still do want it to be well soaked. Now, I always start pre-soaking my yarn in plain tap water with no acid for increased flexibility in case I change my mind with what I want to do later on. But for now, we're going to let this pre-soak for 30 minutes. Again, I sort of want to reiterate that we're doing two yarn bases, one superwash, one non-superwash, in the same yarn line. I think this is important for the comparison because the twist and the sort of spin of the yarn can make a difference in how colors strike as well. If you have a yarn that is really high twist, things might strike differently than if it's more of a low twist single ply. And so here we have the same ply number, the same kind of yardage to weight. The real variable here is the superwash treatment of the fiber before it was spun. For our color palette today, I've selected some Dharma acid dyes. We have Bright Aqua, Peach Blush, Flamingo Pink, And then we have some Pecan Brown that was already mixed with citric acid powder. The ratio we have here is 2 tablespoons of citric acid powder to 1/2 teaspoon of the Pecan Brown acid dye. And I mixed this in one of the bonus videos from the 2023 ChemKnits Hanukkah special. But really, you combine the powders together, mix them up so it's well distributed. One benefit of mixing dyes with citric acid powder is that you can spread it more. And so because you're spreading out the dye particles more, you can get a finer, sharper speckle than if you are going to use the direct dye powder, where when the dye falls on, you're more likely to get larger types of speckles. I don't know if we'll use all 3 of these colors, but we're gonna see how we go and try to treat our 2 skeins as similar as possible. We're gonna start speckling shortly, but first I wanna add some acid in here. Now this white basin, I don't know what volume it holds, but let's go ahead and add 4 tablespoons of white vinegar into it. We could do more. And I'm also gonna add a skein of Knit Pick Stroll. This yarn is 75% superwash merino wool, 25% nylon, and I'll be using this as a yarn mop throughout our project. So when I'm done speckling with one of the dye colors, I'll take my gloved fingertips that'll have dye on it, wipe it on here, likely off camera, rinse and wipe my gloved hands before going into a new dye color. That way I don't mix the colors and create my own unpredictable pre-mixed colors. But now, and the Stroll soaks up water so fast, but now we can go ahead and work on setting up the counter. We don't need to wait very long after adding the acid before moving forward. I know it's a little silly to put the yarn mop in a secondary container when I'm gonna do speckles on the countertop, but that's what we're gonna do right now. And I'm gonna orient things a little differently from how I normally orient things on the counter because, oh dear, hopefully it'll make it easier to see. But I'm gonna lay out our yarn like so, trying to expose a lot. I like to scrunch the yarn because this way if I do a line, it won't be sort of strict. It helps things be a little bit more random and non-repeating. And now I'm gonna go put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves so we can start speckling. Right here we have the superwash, right here is the non-superwash. And we'll zoom out eventually, but I wanted to start, we're gonna use just a little bit of Flamingo Pink. And I'm not quite going all over yet, mainly because I want to let things soak in and see if we see any difference after even just a couple of minutes. Now I've got some peach blush, and I'm pinching up some of the dye in between my gloved fingertips and slowly letting it fall out onto the yarn. The main thing about your gloves is you want to make sure your fingertips are dry before you go back in. Bright Aqua, I think, is one of my favorite colors. And the other nice thing about scrunching up the yarn is that it allows some dye to fall on some of the strands that are beneath some of the others. And now, last but not least, I have some of my Pecan Brown. And this is one where I'm actually going a little bit heavy and then a little bit light. I did squeeze out a lot of liquid from the yarn, so it might take a little bit of time for some of the dye, especially the Pecan Brown, to soak in. But we'll give this, let's go ahead and give this 5 minutes and we'll see what we can see between now and then. After 5 minutes, I'm a little hard pressed to say what differences I see between our superwash and non-superwash. Maybe some of the colors over here feel a little bit more intense and have less spread, but it could be too early to tell. But anyway, we are going to proceed with this overall speckling technique and do it all over the yarn. I put on my respirator, dust mask, safety glasses, and gloves back on and continued to speckle onto the rest of the yarn. And I've realized that with this orientation, you get a really glorious view of the yarn mop that's over to the left, where you can see me wipe my gloves on here before changing colors. There's a chance that after that first 5 minutes, I'm seeing a little more spread in the citric acid speckles on the non-superwash versus the superwash, but it's hard to say for sure because there's still dye on the surface. I tried to wait for a minute or two before flipping the yarn to add color to the other side. And when I flipped the yarn, I tried really hard to not rub it on the counter so that way I could try to avoid intentionally spreading the dyes on the surface of our counter. All right, I think we are good. I'm now gonna go take these to the steamer basket, and I have a different steamer basket set up for each of them. And I did that so that way the yarn won't touch in the steamer basket so we won't get color transfer from one onto the other. So that way our variable is really the dye setting itself. Now, we do have some dye on the counter, and that is what this yarn mop is for. So I'm gonna start off tapping versus rubbing to try to soak up a lot of this color, but eventually we'll start rubbing. Just depends on how much dye there is, and I also don't want to fling the dye onto the ground. That would not be good. I don't have something heavy near me anymore to weigh this down. And we will go ahead and steam set this also for 30 minutes. I don't know if I said I'm going to steam set the yarn for 30 minutes. But once that's done, then we'll steam set the mop. And I also will go ahead and wash the countertop. Don't worry, but this is just a way to soak up that color and create a fun sort of random colorway. It's been 30 minutes, and let's peek at our superwash yarn. Yeah, because it says it's superwash. And we've got some speckles, but you can see because of the twist in this yarn, even those brown speckles are a little bit more spread out than maybe they would be if I had used, say, superwash merino sock yarn that has more twist in it. I'm now going to remove this, lay it in a pan to cool, and we'll take a closer look at our non-superwash yarn. And you know, I do see some speckles left in here, but I think some of the colors, especially like there in the peach, I do feel like some of the colors are more spread out, but we'll have to wait and see for everything to cool. So I'm going to grab this, also place it in the pan. And so there's sections where we had a lot of brown here that are more of a patch, and I can see similar sections over here that are more speckled. And so there's a lot of similarities between these two. There are some areas where our colors are deeper, but right now my feeling is that overall we have more large blown up patches on the non-superwash, and we have more sharper patches on our superwash. But we'll compare that more once everything's dry. I'm gonna set this aside to cool so we can wash it. And we're gonna steam set our yarn mop for 30 minutes. Once the timer goes off, I'm going to set this aside to cool, and then I'll wash it off camera. Let's wash our speckled yarn. So one thing that I would say is I feel like there's more white in the superwash. Likely because the colors didn't spread as much, but I should stop trying to make some comparisons now while while things are wet and before they're dry. I mean, I definitely see speckles on both. Ooh. But yeah, this one, oh. So they're both pretty, and it's funny because I think the difference is more extreme, can be more extreme if you pick different yarn bases. or yarn bases that are more different from one another. But when the only variable is superwash versus non-superwash and everything else, the twist, the thickness of the plies, and etc., when all of that is similar, then the differences can be more subtle. But if you're going to make a hat and you don't care if it's superwash or non-superwash, but you want to get a particular look when you're dyeing it, maybe then you care. But anyway, I'm not seeing any color bleeding. Whenever I do a countertop dyeing technique like this, I really like to make sure that I get the yarn well saturated while washing, just in case there's some dye on the surface that didn't dissolve, so then we can rinse that out. But I'd say we're good to go. So I'm going to put this yarn through my spin dryer and hang it up to dry. Now, looking at the yarn right now, can you tell off the bat which one was superwash and which one was non-superwash? Well, this is our superwash wool of the Andes, and this is our non-superwash wool of the Andes. Let's start zooming in on the non-superwash yarn. We do have speckles here. We have some defined brown speckles that are a little bit larger, slightly blown out, but there's no question that there are speckles here. And also with our pink, I see some speckles there as well. And while there is some white on our non-superwash yarn, most of it is made up with larger patches of pastel color. And I just wanted to zoom in on one more spot of speckles on our non-superwash yarn before looking at a similar area on our superwash. Now, there are sections on the non-superwash yarn where we do see sort of like the really dark spot, and one of those I had just shown you. But overall, when we look at this yarn, we see more speckles and less spread. And I'm seeing a lot more white on here as well. And I believe that's just because the colors did not spread out as much, giving us more of that original bare yarn left there. We do have some spread on the superwash yarn. There are areas that are more pigmented. So a lot of this is much more of, I guess, a gut feeling versus something more concrete. But yeah, the differences are there. Now, had I done this technique with some yarn that, say, Stroll, if I had done this on Stroll, which was also superwash, but then it's fingering weight, so there are thinner plies overall because it's a thinner yarn, and I think they have the same number of plies. The speckles would have been much sharper because that is what happens. So the yarn base itself does make a difference here. And when we're zoomed back, the non-superwash and superwash yarns are very, very similar. The differences are really subtle. But hopefully this video was informative of what you can get with some of those subtle differences. And I will add, this is the most, I think, some of the most successful speckling I've had on non-superwash wool of the Andes ever. And of course, we have our fabulous yarn mop that has a lot of spread because that's the way we were dyeing it. And dyeing it to get that spread. But it's gorgeous, and I don't know, I'm excited to list it in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. So you can go check out my shop now for hand-dyed yarn that's been featured in my videos. And here is all of the yarn. We've got superwash, non-superwash, and yarn mop. I think that if we're gonna zoom in on them, and here, let me rotate this. We've got superwash, non-superwash. Here you can see that we have a lot more white showing on our superwash yarn, but ultimately, there are a lot of similarities here. And I'm rotating it back like that. I'm going to give another huge shout out and thank you to today's lab partner, Lori. Lori, thank you so much for being my lab partner today. It's fun when I get to do a comparison between superwash and non-superwash yarns, especially when results are both similar but subtly different. And yeah, sometimes things have to do with the yarn type as well, because I think the speckles here aren't nearly as sharp as maybe as I would have had on a superwash wool nylon sock yarn that has a little bit more twist to it. But either way, it's a lot of fun, and I hope that you all learned a lot today. Lori, thank you again for being my lab partner. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and in my opinion, doing countertop speckles followed by steaming is one of the best way to get super sharp speckles, because When you add dye to a hot dye bath, yes, things can strike faster, but there's also an opportunity for the dye to dissolve and spread. And so I believe if I was going to use these exact same two yarn bases in the exact same colors, low immersion, we might see more of a difference because of just the circumstances there. But, I mean, you never know until you try it. And so if you want to see me do more superwash versus non-superwash comparisons, drop a like and leave a comment down below. Subscribing to my YouTube channel is the biggest way you can help support the content here. But if you're looking for other ways to help, I do have tons of links of where you can find me on social media. I have affiliate links with the items that I use in my videos and more, all in the video description. And actually, also in the video description, I do chapters on these videos, but within that section, I try to take notes of the dye colors that I use, the approximate amounts of things if I'm measuring and whatnot. And so that is a handy reference if you're trying to go and replicate some of my results sometime. I don't always measure things, but sometimes I do. So it's always worth expanding that video description. But anyway, I can't wait for you to see what I've dyed up next. Thank you so much for watching.